Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Beckham. What I'd like to do here is to share my practical experiences of the Canon RF70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. The combination of this lens and the R5 body just seems to feel right in the hands, but it's very hard to put into words exactly why. Balance, versatility that it gives you when you're shooting, the focal length range, probably a little bit of all those things. Now you can probably tell already that the experiences I'll share are drawn from practical use. I'm afraid I don't do technical. When I bought this lens, I said to a friend that it could be considered pure indulgence because it's quite an expensive lens and it didn't add to the focal length range of the lenses I already had. What I hoped it would add was versatility. Now the price in Australia is just over $4,000. Don't quote me on that because there is some variation. And I've seen prices of £2,300 in the UK. Now remember, I'm an amateur, so justifying the cost of a lens like this could be tricky. But I've found a way around this justification problem. I don't bother. The lens has quickly become a favourite, and I find myself using it much more often than I thought I would. It does add the versatility I had hoped for because of that fast 2.8 aperture and of course the image stabilisation, which is pretty good when coupled to the Canon R5. To demonstrate the image stabilisation, I took a few handheld images of small flowers around the home. These shots are all handheld in low light. The flowers are quite small, as you can see in these images here. Now, not only am I using this lens at its maximum zoom, but I'm also very close to my subject, 14 to 18 inches maybe, and that's always going to make camera shake more likely. I tried to brace myself and take reasonable precautions before shooting, but all these images you're about to see are handheld. Let's take a look at them, and what we're really interested in is the shutter speed in relation to the sharpness. Let's take a look at this image. I've just zoomed in a little bit from the previous. I've got my elbows on the table, so I'm nicely braced to take the shot, but we are hand holding. The focus point is just here. Because we're using a 200mm lens and we're very close, it's almost certain with an aperture of f11 we're going to have some depth of field issues, and we can see a little bit of evidence of that here. But the shutter speed here was half a second. In the previous examples I had the ISO set to 400. What I've done here is to increase that to 800 so I could increase the shutter speed a little bit, but it is just a small amount to 1/4 of a second. Let me just zoom in on this image and we can take a closer look. Now, even if I say so myself, shooting with a 200mm lens this close to the subject with 1/4 of a second and a half a second shutter speed, and to get results like this, is pretty phenomenal. Now, as I move on to the last example in relation to image stabilisation, I should mention that none of these images have been highly manipulated. I opened every single one of them up in Adobe Camera Raw, hit the auto, and that's all that's been done. Nothing has been done to combat noise in any way. Noise shouldn't be much of an issue with this particular image because if you look at the technical details at the bottom of the screen, you can see here I've reduced the ISO to 100, f5.6, but still a very, very slow shutter speed of 1/4 of a second. Now we've probably got acceptable sharpness right in the center of the flower, but we can see some depth and field issues around the outer edge. But I think a quarter of a second, half a second, I've certainly reached my limits there. The results here do show just how effective image stabilization has become. But in practice, we wouldn't rely on slow shutter speeds like these. We would try to give ourselves a slightly better chance, but this simple test does indicate where the boundaries may lie. Now, because of the stability of the Canon R5 with this lens, plus the wide 2.8 aperture, I've never used this lens with a tripod yet. So it is nice to have a detachable lens mount. However, I have found that when removed from the lens, storing the mount in my camera bag is a bit of an issue because it's quite an odd shape when it's detached from the lens. Now the tripod mounts for the 70 to 200mm zoom and also the 100 to 500mm zoom are not interchangeable. So I suppose the best place for them is on the lens, but of course the lenses are more convenient to handhold without them attached. What is nice is that the tripod mounts can be attached without removing the lens from the camera body. This lens has all the options you would expect. A manual and auto focus switch is one of those, but I can't remember the last time I've used manual focus. It would be many years, and I'm talking decades here. Like many people, my eyesight has deteriorated over time, and I don't think I'm unique in having to rely on the autofocus. The lens also has a zoom lock, which I do like. This prevents the lens from gradually zooming out by itself when we've got the lens connected to the camera, maybe on a strap, and we're walking around with the camera over our shoulder. Very useful. There's also a stabilization on-off switch, and when it's turned off, it also controls the camera's in-body image stabilization too. So this one switch is quick and easy to get to without searching menus. The image stabilization has 3 modes. And what you're viewing here is a page from a handbook that you can download for this lens as a PDF. Now, if you've got a mobile tablet or a mobile phone, that could be quite convenient at times. I'm not going to read off what it says against mode 1, 2 and 3. I think if you just pause the video, you can pick it up pretty easily from what you can see on screen. We also have a programmable control ring on all RF lenses. We can use that to control shutter speed, aperture, ISO, etc. Personally, I don't use the control ring on any of my lenses. I already have established control of those options in other ways, and when I did set up the control ring to adjust ISO, I found myself accidentally making changes that I didn't intend. Now I confess that's almost certainly user error on my part, but I reserve judgment because as I become a lot more familiar with the camera, I may tend to return to them and take another look. We also have a switch to restrict focusing for when we're doing more close-up work, but when I took pictures of those flowers, I left it on full and didn't find any issues at all. The filter size for this lens is 77mm, and that's a good size because it's exactly the same size that fits my 24 to 105 zoom, and also the same size that fits my 100 to 500 zoom. And remember the little door you've got in the lens hood that allows you to turn a polarizing filter. But in actual fact, I had a bit of trouble trying to get the polarizer off this lens. Now I didn't put the filter on tight, but I couldn't budge it. So here's a tip if you've not already discovered this. Just get a thin elastic band, wrap it around the outer edge of that polarizing filter, and that gives you all the grip you need to easily remove the filter. Now this lens is quite small, about 150mm in length. And I guess that's another reason why it feels comfortable in practical use. But it's also a very well built lens at around 1 kilo in weight. Now I've become quite conscious as I've got older that being able to carry the equipment we would like to carry does become a bit of a problem. Quite a bit of the photography that I now do is about choosing just one lens for the subjects that I hope to shoot and walking around with just that camera and the one lens. To capture some images for this video, I took myself to Australia Zoo with just the Canon R5 and the 70 to 200mm f2.8 lens. And I captured these few images in just over a couple of hours. This is another image from Australia Zoo, but here I have cropped in a bit because this frog is tiny, no bigger than a small matchbox. But I still have an image 5525 pixels on the long side. This is a very good all-round lens, suitable for practically any subject, even large subjects like this. Here's another example of the versatility of this lens that I shot purposely for this video. We have the superb focusing options of the Canon R5, but coupled with a lens that can open up to f2.8, and at 200mm it's so easy to handle. Now it would have been nice had the bird of prey come a little closer to me. And you're viewing the actual picture I shot, so you can see the size of the bird in relation to the size of the frame. But we were able to use 1/6400th of a second. Although the lens wasn't wide open at 2.8, it was f3.2, but it could have been 2.8. It wouldn't have made any difference. The ISO is kept low at 200, so we don't have noise issues to worry about. Now, because of all that, we can zoom into this bird and we can retain quality. Here we're looking at exactly the same frame as before, All I've done here is to crop in and rotate the bird a little. Here's another image from the same session. The settings are very much the same as the first. I used manual exposure for this shot and all of the previous. There was some white clouds in the sky, so as your camera pans over the white clouds, if you're using any automatic settings like aperture priority, then the exposure can be affected. A manual exposure is fixed, and I could then make sure I had a very high shutter speed. I used the servo option for focusing along with the large zone horizontal focus option from the R5, and of course the fast shutter speed. Here's an image I showed much earlier. I took this just as an example of focusing close and at the maximum 200mm, but nevertheless a little bit of Photoshop work to change the colour of the background and we have an acceptable shot. While I was at the zoo shooting the animal shots you saw earlier, as a technical exercise I shot this too. It's a handheld shot with a focal length of 81mm, but as you can see from the data there, 0.4 seconds shutter speed, f32, 200 ISO, and all of the surrounding parts of this image that should be sharp are sharp, so we can even take moving water handheld. Now as I bring this video to a close, I hope you've found it interesting and also the example images I've shown. If you have, please consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already done so, and hit the notification bell so YouTube will always inform you when I post a new video. And of course, we haven't even looked at using this lens for handheld video. It's a great focal length for that too. And don't forget, this video and many others can be downloaded from my website. I'll see you next time.